Good morning. My name is Sean Varner, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Little Hoover Commission. I'm standing in for the irreplaceable Pedro Nava this morning. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce the other commissioners who are here. To my far right are Joshua Farga, Janice Sidley, David Byer, and to my far left is Iveta Brigas and Helen Torres. Also today, here with us are Commission's Deputy Executive Director Terry Hardy, Project Manager Tamar Lazars, and a new research analyst with us, Imran Majid. Welcome. I also just wanted to give a special thank you to Helen Torres, who is our subcommittee chairwoman on this matter, on the voter participation. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. This is the Commission's second hearing on voter participation. Today's hearing builds on findings from its most recent hearing about voter participation in California, and will focus on planned election improvements to modernize the voting experience here in Los Angeles. The Commission first will hear from Dean Logan, Registrar of Voters. Well, actually, we're going to change that up today. He's not quite here yet, so he will be, when he gets here, we will have Dean Logan here, Registrar for Voters for Los Angeles County, who will discuss plans for modernizing the voting experience in the county and discuss steps currently underway to implement the Voters' Choice Act in 2020. So we will first hear from a panel on evaluating California's readiness for implementing election reforms. Kim Alexander, President and Founder of the California Voter Foundation, and Jen Tolentino, Director of Policy and Civic Tech for Rock the Vote, will discuss potential opportunities and pitfalls in evaluating electoral reform implementation. The Commission then will hear from James Woodson, Organizing Coordinator for California Calls, who will discuss on-the-ground perspectives on voter participation and experience during elections, and Rosemarie Molina, Civic Engagement Coordinator for Community Coalition, who works with communities in South Los Angeles. Finally, the Commission also will hear from a panel that will discuss the perspectives of various stakeholders in Los Angeles, representing several prominent civic engagement organizations. The panel will feature Kathy Fung, Executive Director of California Common Cause, Rosalind Gold, Senior Director of Policy Research and Advocacy for NALEO Educational Fund, Deanna Katamura, Voting Rights Project Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Paul Spencer, Staff Attorney for Voting Rights at Disability Rights California, and Gabriel Taylor, Voting Rights Advocate at Disability Rights California. The panelists have been asked to discuss how the Los Angeles pilot of Voters' Choice Act can impact the communities that they represent. There will be an opportunity for public comment following testimony of the scheduled witnesses. There are comment cards on the table over there, so if you would fill them out and hand them to Terry. Following the hearing, the Commission will convene its business meeting in this hearing room. I would like to thank the witnesses who submitted written testimony in advance. These materials and other documents related to this study can be viewed and downloaded at the Commission's website. I'm sure all the commissioners here have diligently reviewed the testimony, so I'd ask that each witness to briefly summarize the major points that you would like to make so we can focus our time today on the discussion. I would also just like to thank the Little Hoover Commission staff for organizing this meeting, and it's a little bit different for them having to come down to Los Angeles as opposed to in Sacramento. So thank you very much for all your diligence and all your hard work you do on behalf of the Commission. With that, I'd ask our Deputy Director to please call our first witness.
Good morning, everyone. First, one other piece of business, and that is that the bathrooms are across the hallway directly to outside this room, and the bathroom codes are posted on the door. So with that, we have our first witnesses in front of us. Kim Alexander is the president and founder of the California Voter Foundation, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established to advance the responsible use of technology in the democratic process and improve the voting process to better serve the needs of voters. And Jen Tolentino is the Director of Policy and Civic Tech at Rock the Vote, where she manages the development of civic technology, resources, coordinates external nonprofit and corporate partnerships, and spearheads all voting rights, election administration, and technology policy work. Welcome.
Do I go first?
Go ahead, yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Is there water available? I left my water bottle back there. I wasn't quite ready to testify. I'll just get started then.
Okay.
Good morning. I did submit written testimony, so I hope you get a chance to look that over. It's really a pleasure and honor to speak with you here today. I'm actually 5th generation Angelino, so even though I live in Northern California now, my home is in Los Angeles, as is my heart. So it's always a pleasure to be down here. I wanted to summarize some of my testimony, some of my main points. And I don't want to describe the Voters' Choice Act because I think you're already probably familiar with how it works. I won't review the provisions of it. But it is a significant change coming to our voting process starting next year. And it is being implemented in some California counties starting now. And actually, I live in Sacramento County, and my county is one of the counties that is implementing this new law, and we are the largest and most diverse county implementing it. So the stakes are pretty high in Sacramento. The changes that are going to come are significant in the counties that do implement it, and the changes to this voting system were informed by some election officials and our Secretary of State observing this system implemented in Colorado and seeing it work very successfully. But it's important to point out that California is not Colorado. We're a much bigger and more diverse state, so we have unique challenges that we face in implementing these changes. When this bill was in the legislature, we did not take a position on it. We were neutral. We sought some amendments on the bill. We did get some amendments taken to the bill. I want to share with you real briefly the key reasons why we chose not to support it. Number one, the optional nature of the law we think is going to make for a confusing experience for voters. Voters live and work in different counties. They rely on friends and family members who also live and work in different counties to help them prepare to vote. And when you have voters having different voting experiences, it can reduce the ability for voters to help one another. And so we're concerned that having some voters be automatically sent a vote by mail ballot, whether they requested one, while other voters have to request one in a neighboring county. Some voters having neighborhood polling places that are open for one day but within walking distance, versus other voters not having that but having vote centers open over multiple days. That these variations are going to result in, we fear, some pretty major voter confusion. And it's compounded by the fact that while voters live in counties, they also live in media markets. And so, when you do voter education, you're sort of doing a whole media market, and that's not broken out by county lines. So in Sacramento, people who live in Yolo County and Solano County hear the same news that we do, have the same media sources, but they're going to have a different experience. The other reason why we decided not to support the bill and take a neutral position was because we've been studying the vote by mail system in California for some time now. We published a report in 2014 looking at 3 counties and how they process vote by mail ballots and how many people are actually not having their ballots counted when they vote by mail and what the reasons were for those ballots being rejected. And what we see in the vote by mail system in California is that while it's grown increasingly popular, we've also seen this rather high, especially compared to other states, vote by mail ballot rejection rate in California. People don't all successfully vote by mail, so there is a disenfranchisement element that's happening here that's really unseen unless you go into county election offices like I do in the days after the election and see the piles of ballots that are sitting there that can't be processed. We've changed some laws to make it so more ballots will be accepted and not rejected. We enacted the postmark +3 law, which gives 3 extra days for the ballots to come in. That's a great reform that's helped reduce the errors and rejections. I'm sorry, I really need to get my water. I'm not going to be able to, pardon me for a moment. Excuse me. Thanks. We have reduced the rejection rate. We passed a law that does not require counties, and this is the key thing to know. that lets counties contact voters if a signature is missing on a vote by mail envelope. And the voters can send that signature in separately, which is a great improvement. In my testimony, I summarized 4 counties that we looked at that employed this voluntarily to help their voters rescue their ballots. And in the 4 counties that we looked at, Sacramento, Orange, Santa Cruz, and Shasta, more than 4,000 voters' ballots were rescued in the 2016 election because their county registrars of voters contacted them and told them, you forgot to sign your ballot envelope, send us your signature and we'll attach it and we'll cure your ballot and we'll count your ballot. But that law is not mandatory. And so we did successfully get an amendment put into SB 450 that requires counties that opt in to contact voters who have missing signatures. But other counties that aren't opting in are still going to get ballots that are missing signatures, and they're not required to do anything about that. And whether counties contact voters, do that extra legwork, depends on the disposition of the registrar of voters, but more importantly, the resources of that county elections office. And this really is the crux of the problems and the message I really want to share with you that I want you to understand. It's taken me 20 years working in the field of California elections to see that the obstacle that stands in our way is money. It's always money. So we have these conversations about what should we do to change our voting process, but at the end of the day, if the money is not there to pay for the things that we want, then people aren't going to have the voting experiences that we want them to have. And the challenge is always, how do you make it a priority for lawmakers? So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I want to finish out the thoughts about why we had stayed neutral on the bill. We did also ask for an amendment for voters that have signatures that are found to not adequately match the signature on file, to give them a chance to cure their ballot as well. That was not added into the bill. So the top 3 reasons historically why ballots have been rejected is because they arrive too late, there's a missing signature, or the signature doesn't match. So we've addressed the late issue to a large extent for everybody. Signature missing, we've addressed it on a voluntary basis for counties that opt in, and correcting signatures, we don't really have any provisions for that. Other states that have wide-scale use of vote by mail, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, their county registrars are all required to contact voters that have problems with their vote by mail ballots, like missing or mismatched signatures, and give them an opportunity to correct them. That's not optional, it's required. So we are out of step with other states. So the third reason why, and this again goes back to money, why we didn't support SB 450 is because the counties that deploy the system aren't required to provide postage-paid vote by mail ballot return envelopes, and we think that sends the wrong message to voters. We think that voters that suddenly find their local polling place is no longer an option and being sent a vote by mail ballot, which will be a great benefit for many people, they may have a negative reaction to the fact that they're going to have to find a stamp and put it on the ballot and get it in the mail. Now, there will be drop boxes and other ways to get your ballots in, but we still call them vote by mail ballots. So the message to the voter is, this is meant to be used through the mail. So we are supporting a bill that would require all counties, whether they opt into the system or not, to provide postage paid envelopes, but it would cost $5 million, and the governor doesn't want to pay for that. So that bill has become a 2-year bill, and again, we get back to the crux of the matter, which is that elections are chronically underfunded in California. Since Jerry Brown became governor, he has suspended mandates for election programs in the state budget. And as a result of that, did the mic just do something? As a result of that, the legislature increasingly passes optional laws for elections. They don't require counties to do something because under the California Constitution, you have to pay for it. You have to, when the state mandates counties do something, the state has to pay for it. So the way that we get around that is by the legislature passing laws that permit but do not require. So now we have all these voters with different rights in California. And this is really one of the biggest problems. We're not providing equal protection for California voters, and this is why I filed a declaration in support of the ACLU's recent lawsuit challenging California's vote by mail ballot rejection laws, because we want to see those laws change. And unfortunately, legislative reforms are not successful because the governor vetoes those bills. So proponents that want to see reform have to go to the legal process to try to seek that reform. So we did develop an election funding proposal through a working group convened through the Future of California Elections and the California Voter Foundation. We came up with a funding proposal modeled after the local control funding formula, where the state would provide half the costs of elections to the counties, and in exchange the counties would agree to abide by state laws that require them to provide certain services for voters. We haven't submitted it yet in legislation because there's been another funding proposal for voting equipment that's been pending in the legislature. We didn't want to muddy the waters there. But I'm hopeful that we can find an author for this proposal. Maybe it's something that we can send to the Little Hoover Commission to look at. Maybe it's something you would be interested in helping us find a way to get this funded. But we need the state to be a partner financially in the cost of elections. And if the state would pony up some funds to the counties, we estimate half of those costs would be, we estimate $64 million annually, which is really not a lot to get equal protection and equal treatment for all voters. Right now we have a situation where if you live in LA County and you have a great registrar of voters with a great staff and lots of innovation and technology, you could go and vote early the weekends before the elections. It was a great service that Dean Logan and his staff rolled out, but other counties don't have the resources to do that. You know, we like to congratulate ourselves in California when we say, well, we don't put up all the barriers to voting that other states put up, and that's true. We don't have difficult vote by mail sign-up laws. Anyone can sign up to vote by mail. We don't have strong anti-purge laws that take people off the rolls quickly. We give people the benefit of the doubt, but we also are not passing laws that require counties to provide services to voters. Voters are not entitled to vote the weekend before the election. Another optional law is, so some counties will open up weekend voting centers, others don't, and if you don't live in one of those counties, too bad. Some counties let voters ask for a vote by mail ballot over the phone, but not all do. And if you have that right in your county, you effectively have one more week than another voter to ask for a vote by mail ballot. As I said, some voters will get contacted if their signatures are missing and others don't, and their ballots get rejected and they're disenfranchised. So I really want to just emphasize this funding issue as being a core issue that I've been focused on, and while I finally see it, I'm honestly daunted by the prospects of trying to address this fundamental structural problem in the process. So I would welcome any help that the Little Hoover Commission might want to provide. There are a lot of groups that are working on this too and are supportive of this idea, but we definitely, it's definitely a big, like the local control funding formula program took several years to bring about, this also would take multiple years to bring about. And then the last thing I just want to mention, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions too, is I just want to draw your attention to Mindy Romero and the California Civic Engagement Project's recent research, which I hope the staff will distribute to you if they haven't already, on how California voters view vote centers and the idea of vote centers. And again, it's an idea right now. We haven't deployed it, so it's conceptual, but the survey found that the overwhelming majority of voters, 61%, did not like the idea of vote centers. 2/3 of the voters surveyed said that they were willing to travel only 15 minutes to go and vote. And 1 in 4 voters who don't currently use the mail now to vote to send in their ballot said they do not trust the U.S. Postal Service to get their ballot in safely in time to be counted. So these are some serious obstacles. We are committed to seeing this program implemented effectively in the counties that choose to implement it. And in my own county, I am participating and attending lots of meetings and watching the county figure out in real time how to implement the nitty-gritty details of this program. And in my testimony, I detailed some of the examples of things that have come up. And I keep popping my P's, I guess, and popping my mic out. And you know, we don't have regulations yet in place for this program. So we have the law, but as you know, the law is not going to provide every single detail. So one of the things that came up early was, will voters that vote at vote centers have to put their ballots in vote by mail envelopes? And the county said, we haven't decided that yet. And I said, this is not what people are expecting. They're expecting to put a ballot in the box. So the Secretary of State fortunately intervened and quickly issued a directive to the county saying this is how you're going to do it, and so that little problem was resolved. Now the new one that's come up is if voters don't have their vote by mail ballot on hand to turn in, will they have to cast a provisional ballot or will they get a regular ballot? The county says they're undecided on that. That too will make voters very unhappy if they have to fill out a provisional ballot envelope when they go to a vote center, and I guarantee you they are not going to have their ballots with them. Voters that show up at polling places now don't have their ballots with them, and they opted in to vote by mail, but they forgot it, that they requested one, or they say they didn't get it in the mail, or they lost it. They show up at a polling place and they want to vote, and they're given a provisional ballot. This is why our provisional ballot rate is so high. So there's a bill pending right now. If the governor signs it, it will hopefully deal with this issue. But in the meantime, the county is making decisions, and more importantly, buying voting equipment right now that we're going to use for 10 years. And we are literally, not making up, but developing and sorting out these details as we go along. So it's very intense. The Secretary of State has a working group. I'm part of the Sacramento working group. And it's a lot going on. And the staff in Sacramento is working very hard. They have many staff people involved. A lot of citizens are involved. In fact, it's been one of the most exciting parts of the process is to see all these people getting involved who really care about the voting process. So I'm committed to continuing to participate in that. And I really appreciate the committee's, the commission's interest in this issue. Look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the commissioners?
I want to make sure I understand how to use this myself. So thank you so much for your time and your testimony this morning. A couple of things. You mentioned that you stayed neutral, or your organization stayed neutral on the bill, and you highlighted some of the aspects of concern with the bill. What were the aspects that you thought were more progressive or that were right with the bill?
Well, if the bill required all the counties to do this, we probably would have taken a different position. It was really the optional nature of it, which by making it optional, the state's not on the hook to have to pay for it. But if we were, the Colorado model is a uniform statewide voting system. All voters in Colorado have the same voting rights. And although we've called this the Colorado model, that's really not what we've done. What we're doing is creating the situation that existed in Colorado before they adopted a uniform statewide system. The things that I like about it, especially, are sending everybody a ballot in the mail. I think that that's going to help get people who have been tuned out of the election more engaged, putting it right under their noses. I really like the idea of, I love the idea of vote centers. I wish we could have vote centers and polling places, to be quite frank with you. I think that could be a huge benefit. I love the idea that you could go anywhere in your county to vote. I love the idea that there could be real-time access in a vote center, so you could know, the staff could know whether someone voted immediately. I think my own county is having a hard time believing that that's going to actually happen, so they want to stick to what they know, how they know how to do this, which is to put ballots inside envelopes so they can be protected and not mixed in with the rest. But the idea is that you could go in, they could verify that you haven't submitted your vote by mail ballot and let you vote a regular ballot right there and have a satisfying voting experience. So I think that could really be beneficial, and I hope that the bill will create a better voting environment. I'm seeing my county work to site these locations right now, looking at what would be a suitable location, and learning that a lot of our existing locations aren't truly handicap accessible and don't have adequate parking and don't have adequate lighting. And so, because we're moving from 548 polling places to 78 vote centers, the county can focus more on having high quality voting experience at those 78 locations. So I think that's a better use of their resources. And I hope that I hope they have more visibility. Polling places right now are not necessarily that easy to find. Sometimes they're tucked away in someone's garage or something like that. But if the vote center is in a community center or a library or someplace, then I think, like, I've been thinking it'd be great to have one at my YMCA. You know, I don't know if it's gonna work or not, but people from all over the county go to the YMCA. And so it's a way for people to build voting in with, you know, other things they might be doing in their lives.
Thank you for your testimony. I have two questions, and if you could be succinct in answering them, because I'm not designing them for like a long answer.
Okay.
Is there significant voter fraud in California, and if so, what should we do about it?
You want me to be succinct in answering that
Yes.
question? I do not believe there is sufficient voter fraud. There's a widespread perception. In fact, I am glad you asked me this because I have some data to share with you from a
If you could
survey.
share this data with the staff, is there anything we should do?
Well, yes, there are a number of things that we could do. One of them is that in this scenario, in context of this bill, this change, we can require counties where they find voters are attempting to vote more than once to contact those voters and tell them that's not lawful. I know they have an administrative procedure on the back end to prevent people from voting more than once, but voters perceive that there's a risk and they should not be expected to know those administrative procedures. So I think the counties need to make aware to everybody that they will investigate and follow up with voters that attempt to vote more than once, whether mistakenly or deliberately.
Okay. The second question is, I understand the position your organization took about legislation while it was pending.
Yes.
Well, right now it's the law.
Right.
So let's put on your hat as being in charge of implementing the law. Not complaining about it, just implementing. And let's assume you have a limited number of assets. What's the one thing you would make sure that got done under existing law to improve voter participation? Just one.
In the context of the Voters' Choice Act, or?
Yes.
Well, I would have the legislature and the governor agree to fund election
No.
programs.
You've got a finite amount of money, it's not gonna change. You're in charge. You can decide you wanna spend more time dealing with one kind of voting problem, accessibility, language, just, some other thing.
Yes.
What's the biggest thing that should happen under existing law and within existing resources?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, we think voters should be able to have their vote by mail ballots cured, and so they can be counted and not
Okay,
disenfranchised.
so that's the most important thing.
Well, I will say it's one of them. I can't really prioritize them on the spot like that, Mr. Byer, but I will say that at the moment, that is one of my top things I'd like to see.
And the percentage of votes that need to be cured is 1%?
In the last presidential election, over 50,000 ballots representing 0.5% of all the ballots cast were rejected, the vote by mail ballots cast.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Ms. Tolentino?
Hi, good morning. First, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the hearing. I'm really excited that the commission is taking an in-depth look at voter participation. I think it's a really important issue, and there's a number of different nuances. Rock the Vote specifically is interested in engaging and building the local power of young voters. So that's the perspective that I will bring to today's hearing in terms of how can we as a state do better at engaging young people in the political process. So just to provide you a little bit of context in terms of what Rock the Vote does and sort of what our reach is across the country, last year we processed 1.7 million voter registration applications with a number of different partners, including nonprofits, corporations, and influencers, just trying to reach young people where they are to get them registered and get them out to the polls. So that represents, in California, there were 230,000 specifically for the state. And then because we are focused on young voters, 60% of the people that we registered were first-time voters, and we successfully got them to vote at a rate of 81%. And so that represents third-party sort of commitment to providing them with the resources to, where do they need to go to vote? Why is this important? Giving them reminders about what's, where do you go? What time is it available? Do you have early vote options? And so that's sort of the core of what Rock the Vote is really focused on. So I wanted to kind of just give a brief overview of the barriers to participation that we see specifically for young voters. And I see them as 3 buckets. One being policy barriers to participation, things that just make it a little bit more difficult for that constituency. 2 is gaps in civic education and awareness and knowledge. So a lot of young voters don't, and voters in general, don't know that there is an election if it's local, or they don't know where to go, or they don't know what they need to bring. And then also, this is more specific to young voters, is skepticism in the process of, does my vote matter? Why should I care? How do you really focus on making this a meaningful impact? Because young people today are very passionate about issues. They care a lot about improving their world, but they don't always see participation in elections as a means to that end. So I think for the purposes of this commission, obviously I will be focusing more on probably the first 2, but in my testimony that I submitted, I have some other ideas that might be useful to take into consideration in how Rock the Vote addresses the other 2 gaps, or the other gap. So as we all know, we've talked about it, California is implementing 2 really large pieces of election legislation in the process, the new Voters' Choice Act and the new Voter Act. When we think about, from Rock the Vote's perspective, the things that are going to be really important for our constituency, for the new Motor Voter Act, that's obviously really focused on the DMV. And that's focused on how you are going to be getting your registration updated automatically, perhaps by, interacting with the DMV. As I mentioned before, third parties like Rock the Vote, Facebook, we drive a ton of traffic for voter registration outside of this typical state agencies. And because we're registering voters, we're also collecting information to perform GOTV. So we have a sort of really essential role and have often been really large drivers of voter registration. So for us, one of the things that we're sort of thinking about is there will be less of a need in our space to register voters because a lot of them will be caught by the DMV once that law is implemented, which is fantastic. We're super excited. We're not as in the weeds in terms of implementation, but we're expecting that there will be less of a need for that, and we can focus on GOTV, which is great. The one concern that we have is, we will still be doing voter registration, but the people that aren't interacting with the DMVs, the ones that don't have IDs that are required to use online voter registration, are the ones that obviously won't be caught at the DMV and that also aren't really eligible to use online voter registration in a meaningful way. And so our recommendation would be trying to implement some procedure that would allow for the acceptance of online voter registration, not necessarily requiring some sort of state-issued ID. And a handful of states, I believe it's 7 specifically, allow online voter registration without requiring a state ID, and that gets to about, I believe across the country, 10% of eligible voters don't have an ID, and those are going to be the most vulnerable populations. So I think it's really great progress, but also just being aware of these other constituencies that we want to protect. And then the other component around the Voters' Choice Act, which I know Kim covered a lot, our big interest in that space is, as a third party that does a lot of work around GOTV, we rely really heavily on official data to tell us where these sites are going to be, and then displaying them in interesting different ways, and just using official data so that we can tell people where to go. Right now, we work with the Voting Information Project data, which is a standardized source that comes from the Secretary of State's website, or Secretary of State's office, and then is released through the Google Civic Information API. And we're able to build a polling place lookup tool that will tell anybody where their polling location is, the hours, the information. And I would encourage any of the counties and the state to sort of move toward that model and increase the use of VIP for the vote center. So the counties are currently participating in the project. The counties that do the vote centers,
updating their feed to include that information, I think will be essential, because you'll have then access to companies like Facebook and Google that will be able to also share the official information about where now the polling location is. So now you used to go into the same place every year, you don't need to look it up, but you do a quick Google search and it tells you, cool, I have to go to my YMCA. Easy. It's just one of those things that I think is really important and that we use at Rock the Vote, but it also expands the reach of everything. So those are sort of the policy areas that I think that there are opportunities in California. The other piece that I just wanted to briefly touch on was how do we kind of address the gap in civic education awareness. At Rock the Vote, we rely really heavily on influencers and companies and brands. We have a strong brand, but we only have a strong brand because we really connect with different companies and celebrities that have an authentic message. We have sort of an ecosystem, and nonprofits have an ecosystem of people that they talk to, but the importance really isn't just getting the people that we already know are engaged, but trying really hard to reach the people that aren't already bought into the process, and that's sort of where we began the Corporate Civic Responsibility Program, which is co-chaired by California Secretary of State Alex Padilla, to identify different companies and brands that would be helpful in sort of breaking out of this kind of political bubble that I think people really often have, in identifying like how do you get somebody who is working as an associate salesperson at American Eagle. Like they're, you know, they have a lot of other different issues, but if they have an opportunity and there's some sort of, you know, not incentive, we did not incentivize anybody to register to vote, but just sort of putting the resources in front of them and getting them the information in a lot of different places and making it really easy. That was sort of, we saw to be really effective. We definitely saw the impact, and it was more effective in different spaces and by different influencers, which I am happy to talk about, but we found that to be a really useful way to try and reach young people in a way that we think is useful. And then just quickly to touch on the third point of breaking down the skepticism, what we've started to pilot this year is building out voter guides, and we've done it in a handful of local elections, and our first one was in Los Angeles. And it's, one, young people don't know there's an election, but two, they don't know how a local election is going to affect them. So why should they care about a school board? Why should they care about their mayor or their city council, and what do they do? So we're partnering with local partners. Rock the Vote is national. We're pretty small, actually. And so working with local partners to identify what are the things that really matter in your community, and then trying to link that to the candidates that are going to be on the ballot. So we're looking to expand that next year statewide in California. It's going to be difficult, but it is something that we've seen some success in, and we're trying really hard to get young people engaged with the information they need and break down the barriers that they sort of see to not wanting to participate. So that's, thank you.
Thank you. I have a quick question for you on that. I'm really intrigued by what you do. I've been in the social media space, but I think the social media space has various demographics now. It used to be targeted towards younger people, but now I think you're getting older generations that are involved in social media. So has Rock the Vote looked at ways of engaging not only younger voters, but older voters as well in this process? Because I think what you're doing with connecting or trying to expose the issues to the candidates that are supporting or not supporting those issues is a way to get engagement from the voting public.
Yeah, so we specifically, our mission is focused on young people, and so trying not to do too much scope creep is important. The way that we've built out our candidate questionnaire and portal, it is open, and the questions typically are maybe a little bit more focused on the issues that we've polled and young people care about. But it's not, and we have a digital component, a video part, where we have the candidates speak directly to camera, and it's really best when it's just their cell phone camera, and they just answer the question of why are you going to be a champion for young voters? So we found that making it not just more generic is more impactful for our purposes. And I think we've also found that where people have given us resources that are sort of tailored for the general public aren't as impactful as ones that are actually made just for young people. But we're happy to share what we do if anybody wants to reuse it.
I have a question, building on actually what Sean has asked, and I'm embarrassed to say that I registered to vote before I had my email address. So when people register now, is the email address asked for on the card when you so we have it, right?
It's voluntary.
But we've captured that data, that information, or you, Dean, are shaking your head, and you are key to this, I guess, and we'll wait for you to testify. But I'm just trying to think of, you mentioned that you registered people to vote, but then you continue to contact with them to get them to the polling place. We've also talked about, well, people don't necessarily know that there's an election going on. So if one of the ways is to expand our tools, but not necessarily use too much more money, as you are suggesting. So if that data is there somewhere, can we, I'm curious what people think about sending out an email reminder that there is an election. Are people going to feel that somehow we've corrupted the system, that you're now creeping into, you're going a little bit too far, or how would people perceive getting an email in their email box that says, there's an election in a week, don't forget to vote, something like that. I think your experience has been it's helpful when people get out to vote. What would your opinion be of that?
I think that voters would welcome that email from their registrar of voters. The problem is if you include that in the voter record, then it's available to all the secondary users, including political campaigns, and a lot of voters don't want campaigns to have their email or their cell phone number and get calls. So we recommended, having so a lot of voters don't provide those two fields, they're optional. And so we have recommended in the past, and I continue to recommend, that we change the law to allow voters to establish that certain parts of their voter registration record are to be only used for administrative purposes. If we did that, then it would not only allow county registrars to do this kind of interface, which they want to do, many of them, but also give them the ability to quickly contact voters when there's a missing signature or something like that. The ones that do that outreach have a hard time of it because they often don't have a phone number or an email. All they can do is send something in the mail, which takes a lot of time and it's expensive. So there is a solution, but the challenge is the people who would make the law that would create those parameters around those optional fields are the politicians who use the data for their political campaigns. So it's hard to convince them to do that, but worthwhile.
Okay, thank you.
Josh?
For Jen, real quick, you said, so you registered a bunch of first-time voters, and the voter rate was 81%, correct? One, how did you track that, and what kind of drop-off did that show up on the next election cycle?
So that was for, one, we tracked it by, we collect some of the non-sensitive information before we pass them over to the Secretary of State's website. There's like a data pre-population component, so that information we're able to use to perform the GOTV in a really targeted way, and then to match them back to the voter file. So we're able to identify like who were these people and did they vote or not. And I don't have data on, that was the 2016 November election. I don't have data from the LA election that we've done, so we don't really get nuanced information on turnout for local elections. I think everybody saw turnout for the local elections has not been great, which is really disappointing. But I'm hopeful. We're working in Virginia right now, which is statewide, so we have more information on that. And we're in the process of kind of culling it. It's not looking as good as 81%, certainly, but that's sort of what we're trying to like. I think the percentage will be more based on what was it historically, and then what was our turnout rate compared to like everybody else.
My question was around, and I wanted to make sure I got the figure right. I believe you said 10% of voters across the nation do not have an ID. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Do you have numbers for California?
I haven't seen numbers specifically for California, but we can try and find some. That number, I believe, is from the ACLU.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thanks to both of you for what you do. I'm a big Rock the Vote fan. My now adult daughters did Rock the Vote and did voter registration, so I'm familiar with what you do. So my question relates to a study that was out just this week from Tufts University about college student voting, and contradicted the myth of a decline in young people voting in this last election. And it points out some gender differences where women voted than was expected. The voting rates for different ethnic groups was different. So what can we learn about that constituency that is college age, enrolled in college, and apply it to the non-college workforce? And so how do you differentiate in what Rock the Vote does from the relatively straightforward or easier audiences of colleges? Because you've got a bunch of kids and you can do an event and you can do a whole bunch of things on a college campus which you might not be able to do with a bunch of disparate workers whose schedules are different and live in different places.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. One of the things we very explicitly, we're not just focused on students. I think there are groups that focus on students, but while we are engaged in college campuses, we try really hard to also be present in community colleges, not big universities. And then also when we're thinking about where we're doing engagement, it's not just students, it's young people. And the ones that are not necessarily enrolled in a four-year institution, those are the ones that are going to fall into that third category of skepticism, and reaching them where they are, not necessarily through college campuses, is really important. And that's sort of the work that we were doing with the Corporate Civic Responsibility Program, where if you are following Becky G on Twitter and like you really liked her in Power Rangers, she's also kind of giving you some information about there's an election, it's important to me, it's important to you, this is why. And sort of the connecting the issues and connecting this passion that this generation really has for improving their community and identifying how you can match that to electoral power and like what that actually means, really, really hard. But that's sort of what we're trying to focus on. It's not so much on the ground activations, it's much more breaking outside of that. Like, we're not focused on the people that are already gonna vote. Those are like, that's not sort of what we're here for. It's who are the people that don't believe that their vote matters, and how do we move them from there to actually participating? So that's what we focus on.
Thank you.
If I could just add to a recent change in law that took effect this year is a law that allows 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. And I think that's a really great reform. It allows people to get into the hopper while they're still in an institutional setting in high school. And actually this week we had National Voter Registration Week, and our Secretary of State was at high schools pre-registering people to vote. So that, I think, is a good way to make sure, because once they get out, you're right, if they don't go into another institution, we can lose them.
You have a question?
I got one. We talked a little bit about the motor voter thing. So you said there's 7 states that don't require IDs or government issued IDs. What forms of IDs are they using, or what process are they using to verify that?
So they typically, and it depends, but some of them allow you to submit an electronic signature, either by signing on a stylus or taking a picture of something that you sign and then you take a picture of it, or you can upload a utility bill to prove that you live at that residency. You're essentially like, it's similar to if you submit a paper form and you don't have an ID, you're in California able to sign that you are eligible. It's just sort of how do you affirm that you are eligible to vote in this jurisdiction.
You sign under penalty of perjury too.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for your testimony.
Thank you for having me.
We don't know.
All right.
Who's Becky G?
She was the yellow Power Ranger.
Okay,
Ah.
there's a green one,
Wait,
a
with
blue
the
one.
new yellow Power
She's
Ranger,
the
the
new,
old?
No, the
obviously the new one.
Obviously. We would have known if she was the old one.
Right, right.
I would
I
know.
need 11-year-old boy twins.
All right, I think we are going to go back now.
So, yes, up next we have Dean Logan. He has served as the Registrar of Voters for Los Angeles County since 2006.
He is responsible for registering voters, maintaining voter files, administering elections, and verifying initiatives, referenda, and recall petitions in the largest and most complex county election jurisdiction in the nation. Welcome, Mr. Logan.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, and good morning, and thank you for your flexibility. It's somewhat embarrassing to be the local person and be the one stuck in traffic, but we were actually in the block of the building, and I probably should have just bailed from my car and walked, but I appreciate your flexibility. So I am Dean Logan. I'm the Registrar Recorder County Clerk for Los Angeles County, and I'm excited that you're holding the hearing today in Los Angeles County and appreciative of the opportunity to provide comments on our efforts to improve and modernize the voting experience for Los Angeles County through our Voting Solutions for All People initiative. And I'm glad that, I hope that you had an opportunity to touch and feel the prototype earlier this morning. The size, complexity, and demographics of LA County demand that we consistently work to improve the voting experience. Removing administrative barriers and obstacles that make it difficult for voters to participate in the voting process is one of our top priorities. So I truly appreciate the Commission's strong interest in seeking to understand and improve voter participation. More than any time in our history, the integrity of elections and the public's confidence in voting are paramount in ensuring the continuity of our representative form of government. We as election administrators do not have influence over what drives the excitement about an election or the level of interest in candidates that appear on the ballot. It is therefore important, though, that we focus on where we do have some influence, and that is to remove the administrative challenges that get in the way of those voters who want to participate when they are met with those intrinsic values that get them excited about the voting process. Our voters deserve a voting experience that is aligned with the needs and priorities, and a voting system built with a new perspective that looks beyond technology to engage citizens in the voting process. After more than a decade of regulatory gridlock, shrinkage in the commercial voting systems market, we knew that modernizing voting in America's largest county would be challenging, but necessary for continued voter engagement. To meet this challenge head-on, we launched the Voting Solutions for All People initiative to reimagine and create a voting experience that is convenient, accessible, and responsive to all voters. Our vision is to ensure that the new voting experience meets the needs of the county's diverse electorate, which includes serving voters who originated from more than 180 countries, providing language support in more than 12 languages, and deploying services in an area that spans more than 4,000 square miles. Through this human-centered, transparent process that we undertook, we brought the needs and expectations of current and future LA County voters to the forefront. With the help of a dynamic and diverse advisory committee comprised of community experts and leaders, some of whom you will hear from today, and a technical team of nationally recognized experts in information security, voting technology, and usability, the project has stayed true to a set of guiding principles that has governed us from the start. The results of our project include systems that leverage modern technology and an open source platform that provides for a publicly owned voting system. We created a design that is agile and adaptable and that meets the needs and values of usability and accessibility without compromising on the importance of security and accountability. This work has been transformational. What we learned exceeded our expectations. We learned that usability is more than mere compliance, and that achieving access for those with disabilities and language needs results in a better experience for all voters. We learned that in serving a population of millions, we can still focus on the needs of individuals. As a result, we adopted a philosophy of meeting voters where they are, introducing a voting experience that is familiar, visible, and available, and that conveys the significance and impact of voter participation. This vision is aligned with the recently adopted Voters' Choice Act that you've heard about this morning, which advances the vote center model and is about providing the greatest number of options to voters and giving them maximum flexibility to cast their ballot. This new model is not without its critics. My hope, though, is that everyone remains focused on a key factor that I believe is beyond debate, and that is that our current election system and voting model is outdated and in dire need of modernization and improvement. From antiquated, inaccessible voting equipment and manual paper-based processes to outdated, limited voting options. We cannot sit back any longer and do nothing when the existing voting experience is inadequate and inconvenient for the voter. Continuing with the status quo is unacceptable. Most of the current concerns and problems that are experienced by voters, along with the complexities of administration and the barriers for those who are currently not participating, can be alleviated by a modernized voting experience that will be realized with the successful implementation of the Voters' Choice Act and the VSAP. We are on the threshold of offering a new voting experience that can be adapted to future changes in election laws, voter behavior, and advances in technology, one that can be shared and adapted to other jurisdictions across the country. In our ongoing effort to maximize the county's readiness for VCA and VSAP, we will continue to engage voters with disabilities and voters who need language assistance to ensure an effective rollout. We worked closely with both communities on the design of the new equipment, including multiple rounds of user testing at locations selected by our stakeholder partners. We fully anticipate that this level of collaboration will continue and even expand in order to achieve successful implementation. Through our VSAP Advisory Committee, our Language Accessibility Advisory Committee, our Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee, we hope to leverage our strong partnerships to engage with these specific communities as we prepare for the transformational change. It is vital that our voters understand the new process and that we provide accessible locations where all voters have the opportunity to vote a secret ballot independently and with dignity. While we believe very strongly that this is the direction that the electorate is seeking, we do not assume that they will know or anticipate that this is coming. We know that a robust education and outreach campaign will be necessary to ensure that the public is aware of and understands the transition. We're currently developing a strategy that will ensure that this critical component does not get overlooked or under-resourced. It's important that we get this right. If we're going to make this type of fundamental change in the voting process across the state and here in Los Angeles County, we cannot afford to have missteps that will ultimately further degrade participation in our elections. Our ultimate goal is to fully implement both VSAP and VCA in time for the presidential primary in 2020, which as of yesterday has moved up to March, so our schedule has been accelerated. Finally, we hope that we can allow Los Angeles County voter behavior to guide how we proceed with elections leading up to and including the 2024 election cycle. Using actual data on voter behavior from 2020 and with further analysis of ongoing issues and challenges with signature verification and concerns about the U.S. Postal Service, we will deliberate with our Board of Supervisors and the legislature on the best path forward for Los Angeles County. In closing, we continue to believe that within appropriate parameters, voters should be able to vote when, where, and how they want. I'm optimistic and encouraged about where we are going, and I believe that our new vision will help eliminate barriers to voter participation. I do not think that any of these elements can do it alone, but they can be an important part of a process, and I look forward to that continued dialogue. I believe we have the opportunity here to make a real difference to the voters of Los Angeles County and across California as a whole. So thank you again for the opportunity to share our vision and to bring in the equipment for you to take a look at, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Logan.
Go ahead.
So I have two suggestions. I could form them as questions, but I'm just going to suggest them. So we looked at your system earlier. I would hope that you would empower a group of people who don't work for you and don't work for the vendor who puts things together to hack the system, because it's vulnerable. And if you say it isn't, I'm not going to believe it.
I've never said that. And so secondly, first, I guess a couple clarifications. There is no vendor. The vendor that we worked with was a design vendor. We own the intellectual property and the design specifications. We will go out to competitive bid for manufacturing. The idea is that the whole idea here is that we won't be stuck in a relationship with a single commercial vendor, proprietary vendor. And we have publicly stated that we are going to bring in people to kick the tires and try to hack it. In fact, we sent members of our staff to the recent DEF CON hacking conference in Las Vegas for that very purpose. So that's very much part of our implementation plan.
Thank you. Second, this is really taking off from the recommendations from the witness from Rock the Vote. From a design point of view, IDEO and other Silicon Valley oriented folks, if you're thinking about voting and it's election day and you have no idea what to do, figuring out a seamless way of integrating a bunch of different systems. Knowing, okay, you can go to a voter center and the wait is 47 minutes versus 14 minutes you had together, the Uber time to get there, the bus connections. Being able to do all that stuff seamlessly seems like a good thing, and I don't know whether that's part of your plan.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that was my point at the end of my testimony about that designing this is one thing, implementing it in a way that makes sense and making sure voters know what to expect is another thing, and that's why we are doing this on a incremental basis. We want to introduce it in 2018 as an option before we go to full implementation in 2020, but we recognize that's a big mountain to climb, but there are a number of tools out there. So as you say, there are ways that you can look, find the closest vote center to you, but also find out what the wait time is at. So it might make sense to go a little further for a shorter wait time. The other thing we're planning to do is to have mobile and pop-up vote center locations. So in addition to the fixed locations, if we know that there's a big farmers market out at the Rose Bowl on the weekend before the election, we want to pop up a vote center out there so that people can come to it. May not make sense to have a physical vote center at the Rose Bowl during the week, but on the weekend, that makes a lot of sense.
So, in an attempt to get you to commit news, so in 2015, there was a speech given by a prominent public official who said that the problem of voter participation could be best addressed by compulsory voting. I know that you know all of the arguments for and against compulsory voting. That official was Barack Obama. And in my view, he put his finger on the fundamental dilemma, which is no matter what we do to improve participation, we're going to continue to be at 2/3 or even 3/4. And that has the net effect of making, in my humble view, us less equal as a people, because you end up exacerbating income inequality. It disadvantages the least among us who have the fewest resources. So if we had compulsory voting and assistance to help people voting, we would be able to be aiming at the correct, bigger target as opposed to moving things around. Could you comment?
I'd be happy to comment. I want to try and stay in my lane as an election administrator and say, I think it's an important dialogue. I think everything should be on the table because I do think we have a crisis of participation. What I will say, though, is I think history has shown that when voters believe that their vote is going to make a difference and believe that it has significance to them individually, they overcome time, place, and equipment, and they do vote. And I would use President Obama as an example. We saw that in 2008 when he ran the first time here in LA County. We saw people lined up around our building the weekends before the election, and they were happy to be lined up around those buildings. So I from that perspective, as an election administrator, what that tells me is my job is to make sure that we provide an experience that facilitates that when they believe that their vote will matter. I'm not sure, this is just commentary on my part. I think there are other things that are compulsory in our day-to-day lives, and that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody actually participates or that they participate in a manner that is informed or active. So I think there's some questions to be wrestled with.
Right, but if you look at the larger social forces that discourage people from voting, the presence of big money, First Amendment, I'm not going to go down the Citizens United path, but the presence of attack advertising to discourage people from thinking that their candidate is any good. There are just all these gigantic forces at work, effectively aiming at suppressing people's participation.
I don't disagree with that at all.
And so you've got billions of dollars being spent to discourage people from what you want them to do, and your budget and capability is very limited in opposition to those forces. And I'm trying to go to the larger question of how do you equalize that?
Thank you.
I have a couple questions. First is what is the percentage of ballots, vote by mail ballots, that you find aren't qualified to be counted for LA County in the last election?
So I don't have these statistics with me. I think they're consistent with what you heard from Kim Alexander's testimony, that it's less than 0.5% of the vote by mail ballots that are returned that are challenged in some manner. Now, we in LA County do make extensive effort to contact those voters to cure those during the period after the election, and there are new laws that they're aiding in that process. But I do think that that's a significant issue, especially with respect to signature verification, because there are so many elements of the election process that rely solely on signature verification as a means of authentication, and people signatures don't match like they did. I mean, they aren't teaching penmanship in schools like they did before. So I think that's an important issue for us to highlight, because I think if we don't find some alternative ways of authenticating voters in the process, that will become an administrative form of disenfranchisement, and that would be unfortunate.
I actually, I mean, I've been an absentee voter for years, and I can tell you my signature has changed a little bit over time. So I was a little concerned that maybe my vote is one of the ones that isn't being counted, because it has become more mature and robust. It definitely doesn't look the same as it did probably when I first filled out the registration form. So maybe that is something to look at. But I've never been contacted, so I'm just assuming, but I have no idea.
You would have been contacted if that was the case. And the other thing is, we do make available to all of our vote by mail voters to go online and check the status of your vote by mail ballot. So you can actually go on and see that we received it and that it's been processed.
And if somebody's vote by mail ballot hasn't been accepted for signature verification or something, do they continue? Will that person continue to receive the vote by mail ballot? So they're going to continue election after election sending in something incorrectly, or you're fairly confident that you've contacted them in one way, shape, or form?
So they will remain. There's nothing in the law that would allow us to remove their act or their status as a vote by mail voter. But what we do is, if after the election, if they hadn't cured it during the cure period, we do send them a letter with a new registration form and tell them that they need to submit an updated signature. So prospectively, in theory,
you try to
that's
address it to
right.
cure that problem. Okay. Then my other question is, in terms of trying to get more voter participation, what are your thoughts about having a voting election on the weekend, or having a day like July 4th, that's election day, or something where on a Tuesday that's voting day, and it's obviously very expensive if you're going to do it during the week and you've had a day off to vote. But given how important voting is, and we have a lot of other holidays, I'm just curious of your thoughts about if that would impact, or if it's better to just have 2 weeks of voting where people can come and go and vote.
I think it's the latter, and I think our data shows that I think that the way people engage and the pace of activity in people's lives, having voting on a single day between a single set of hours and going to a single location, that's the outdated model that I spoke of in my testimony. And I think the Voters' Choice Act got that right, to say that we're going to have a 10-day voting period. It's still going to culminate on election day, and you're still going to get election results on that day, but that really gives you 2 weekends, 2 full weekends. And if we achieve our goal of meeting voters where they're at, instead of them having to come and find voting, but have it visibly out in the community, so when you go to your gym, or when you go to do your grocery shopping, or when you're picking up your kids after work, you see, oh, I could go right here next door and cast my ballot. I think that will have an impact.
And one other question as to LA County specific. So let's say, for example, I stopped at school and picked up my kids and, I'm going to take my kids and go vote, but I don't have the ballot with me in the car. How is LA prepared to deal with the fact that I left my ballot at home, but I'd like to vote today?
Yeah, that's the beauty of the vote center concept, is that you could go to any vote center and you can get your local ballot. So if you live in Santa Monica, but you're in Lancaster, you can go into Lancaster and get your Santa Monica ballot. And we will have real-time updates. So once you sign in at that vote center, if you were issued a vote by mail ballot, it will suspend that vote by mail ballot. You will not have to surrender that in order to vote a regular ballot.
Okay, great. That's great. Thank you.
Hi. Love that experience, actually. I think the such great progress. So I can't wait to see where you guys land next year. Question about your decision about vote by mail for LA. So it's so fascinating to see the huge difference compared to like state averages in terms of vote by mail participation. And I know you guys are expanding, but decided not to go universal on it. Can you talk about some of the trade-offs, like how you thought about that decision? I'm guessing it's going back to Commissioner Byer's thoughts on like trade-offs and financial resources, but just wanted to dive into that a little more.
Sure, I think it's a great question, and LA County does stand out, and there's a lot of questions out there about that.
I just feel like with traffic, I'd be like, why aren't you guys at 100%?
Yeah, and actually across the state, voter behavior has driven that percentage, and so it has been slower in LA County. There are different theories about why that is the case. That from my perspective, Part of it is, frankly, our current vote by mail ballots are not particularly intuitive or user-friendly. We're correcting that with the new system. There are communities in LA County, especially in the urban, high populated areas, where we know from focus groups and talking to voters that their trust of the U.S. Postal Service is just really low, so they don't see that as a viable option. And there are communities that just don't engage. I come from the state of Washington, where vote by mail was one of the early pioneers of vote by mail, and the whole idea behind that was that it was intuitive because it came in your mailbox and you saw it and you put it with your bills. I think that's changed. I think for the emerging generation of voters, I have a son who is very civically engaged, went to college, but I don't think he could tell you the cost of a postage stamp, or might struggle to tell you his mailing address because it's just not something that fits in his sphere of activity. So I think from a behavior standpoint, we need to pay attention to that. For LA County specifically, because we only have about a third of our turnout coming through vote by mail ballots and a third of our electorate requesting vote by mail ballots, we were concerned about putting out 5.2 million ballots and just having them out there on the street. We have seen concerns, we have seen campaign tactics where people try to get creative with vote by mail processes. So our philosophy was, let's let the voters drive their option of voting. And the trade-off for us in LA County is that means we would have more vote centers than are required in the other counties. So if we're not going to mail everybody a ballot, then we need to have a higher number of vote centers, and we need them to be visible. So like I said, so that you actually see them and it triggers to you that you should go vote. That's what I said at the end of my testimony. I think we need to monitor that. I think we need real data to show that, and I think if we see an increase in vote by mail participation, and the implementation will include some increase in vote by mail. Not to get far down in the weeds, but for instance, if neighboring counties adopt the model and we have legislative districts that cross those boundaries, we're going to treat them the same way the other county does, so there's not a disparate treatment that way. But I think that we need to actually go through a couple cycles and actually look at the data and determine, does it make sense to print and mail to 6 million people if they're starting to use the vote centers and finding that as a viable way to participate.
Can you just dive in on the concern of potential fraud? What's the worst case scenario? You send out these ballots, they don't actually get people's mailboxes, people pick them up and fill them in.
Yeah, I think two things I'll mention. I think part of it is a perception concern more than the real concern. I think that when people see ballots just out in the community and they think, what's that? People think of ballots like cash, and then they see them out in the community or at an apartment complex where there's a stack of them sitting instead of in the individual boxes. We've had that happen. I think that the campaign tactics that we have seen and heard about are people going around door to door and telling people that they're there to collect their vote by mail ballots. So we make a concerted effort in a voter education campaign to tell people that there's only two places for you to put your voted ballot. It's either in a mailbox or a ballot box. You don't give it to somebody else, but we've seen that, especially more in local elections, that we've seen that type of activity. Or people intercepting the ballots and trying to fill them out and sign. Not a lot of evidence of that, but I think it's a valid concern.
Yeah, just because you can see that, just last thing, you can see that 30% or whatever your number is data point and think, that's a preference of our voters, or you can see that as a huge opportunity to try to get to where the other counties are. So I was curious about your considerations.
And we definitely see that opportunity as well. And we I wouldn't say we push vote by mail, but we are very transparent about vote by mail being an option for voters in LA County.
Great. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you again for being here. My question was more around the actual voting center and the security and the monitoring that you're going to be implementing, or have you thought about that? And is there an opportunity to communicate that so there's real trust to the public about when they're going to the voting centers?
Sure, and we have a project team that's specifically looking at security and the physical makeup of the vote centers. I think some of that will depend on where those locations are at. So if it's in a building that already has a security presence, I think that we will work on partnerships with that. There's a fine balance on that. You don't want to create too visible of a security presence that feels like something that deters people from voting. At the same time, you want people to have confidence that it's a secure location. I think for us, the bigger security issue is how do we secure that facility at night when we close it, if it's open for 10 days? How do we visibly demonstrate that we've accounted for the ballots, that we're not leaving voted ballots at the location, that the equipment is locked up and not accessible? So we're really focused on that end of it. As far as during the day when voting's actually happening, we intend to rely, much like we do at polling places, on community members and employees who are there visibly watching the process, who are invested in the integrity of the elections process.
So that I'm clear, so it's not gonna be like policemen posted places or.
Correct.
or
I think that
anything
could have a
would be-
negative effect.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Furter?
A couple questions, actually. I'm sure it's pretty extensive, but what type of research are you doing looking into the location of the actual voting centers? Because there are going to be so many fewer. And then also, are there any partnerships being talked about with maybe public transit or Uber, Lyft, getting people there?
Yes, so I completely agree that the whole process of where we site these locations is critical. There are a number of provisions in the bill, some very specific provisions in the bill of considerations we have to look into in terms of public transportation routes, access to parking and population centers and all that. So there's some geospatial analysis that we're doing on that. But we also are right now negotiating a contract with an organization to go out and do extensive public meetings in the community. In LA County, we'll probably do that divisible by 5 by the 5 supervisorial districts. So we want to get public input on that. And those meetings, the idea of that outreach is to actually engage community-based organizations to help facilitate those meetings and to bring them in to help us identify those. So a lot of work being done on that, and I can share more about that with the commission if desired. The second question again?
Partnerships, as far as...
Yes, so partnerships, yes. And actually, I'm glad you asked that because we're in the early stages, but we have recently had a meeting with the civic engagement elements of Google, of Lyft, and Snapchat, and a couple of different organizations for that same purpose, because we want to try to leverage tools that will allow people to have better access and to know what's going on out there. So yes, we're definitely interested in working on forming those kind of partnerships.
Any further questions? Well, thank you very much again for your testimony, and thank you to you and the county for being a leader on this issue.
Thank you very much.